Hello again, and thanks for joining us for another edition, Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, satellite pictures. We've got on there, or satellite hazardous weather. I got satellites on the mind. Hazardous weather graphic. We've got some winter weather advisories for the Arctic coast, the western and eastern Arctic coast. That's for tonight, and that's for winds gusting out of the east and northeast up to 45 miles an hour, and that producing wind chills down to 55 degrees below zero. In some areas, blowing snow, also reducing visibilities to half mile or so. And then down to the south, western Kenai Peninsula and the greater Anchorage area, possibly up into Palmer, Wasilla. That's a winter weather advisory for areas of freezing rain, snow, and rain through tonight. Again, could see some glazed conditions in the areas that stay below about 30 degrees. Definitely if you're in the upper 20s and it rains, you'll see glaze. But that could continue until, let's see, well, overnight tonight, and then that should be over by tomorrow. And about the same thing, winter weather advisory for the northeast Prince William Sound area for Valdez to Thompson Pass. Now looking for more in the way of snow, 4 to 8 inches worth, with northeast winds gusting to 45 miles an hour. And that could create visibilities less than a half mile in areas at times. And again, that's from Valdez to Thompson Pass, Keystone Canyon, those areas. Could pick up 4 to 8 inches of snow. And from there, going to satellite imagery, 2 low pressure area, actually 3, one out over the Bering Sea that's been moving west-northwest under that huge area of high pressure that's up off the eastern Russian coast up over the Arctic there, giving easterly flow northeast over the interior. And that's continuing to move westward there with the snow showers going with it out toward the southwest Bering Sea and in toward Shemya. So conditions improved today over the Pribilos, much drier conditions there. And so still some shower activity from Atka over toward the Unimak Island area. But the front bringing some areas of moisture into Bristol Bay earlier on to about Kodiak Island. But the rainfall over Kodiak, mostly due to the low pressure area in the Gulf, coming up to just south of the Kenai Peninsula this afternoon. That brought about 1/3 of an inch to Kodiak State Airport today. Temperatures in the lower 40s there. And areas of rain from the North Gulf Coast and heavier rain over the central and northeast Kenai Peninsula and up toward Turnagain Arm and Portage into Whittier there, with lighter amounts elsewhere. And gusty winds on the eastern Arctic coast don't really show up here, but the areas of clouds kind of show up as a darker gray area with the clearer skies, very cold temperatures over the north slope. Lower -40s this afternoon, Umiat Airfield, for example. That whole area up there showing up as white, but warmer out toward the Arctic coast with a wind and lower clouds. Otherwise, over the Panhandle, that system mostly cutting in to the south of them and moving northward and washing out over British Columbia. But that brought a fair amount of precipitation to the southern Panhandle during the day today, and about 1/2 inch of rain falling at Heidelberg. Otherwise, much lighter amounts up to the north, with some freezing rain occurring over the northern areas of the northern Panhandle. Some areas of freezing rain and snow mixed, or just snow at the higher elevations there. And then the areas of mixed precipitation, south central Alaska, mostly rain on the North Gulf Coast, and rain with temperatures into the lower 40s, areas of the Kenai Peninsula. In fact, from about Kenai Lake, north and northeastward there to Portage and Turnagain Arm, anywhere from 1 to 2 inches of rain fell during the day today there. Otherwise, as I mentioned, Kodiak picking up about 1/3 of an inch, and everywhere else seeing lesser amounts. Bristol Bay, some areas of snow, showery conditions for the Alaska Peninsula, scattered showers of snow for the eastern Aleutians, and actually pretty dry for the Pribilofs today. They're on the other side of that trough, with the main bulk of the moisture traveling westward and southwestward with that low just northeast of Amchitka Island. Otherwise, winds, you can see the tighter gradient up over the western Brooks Range and along the west coast there, as well as the southern coast of the Seward Peninsula. Golovin had winds gusting over 50 miles an hour today, so still pretty windy in that area, with gusts 25 to 35 toward Nome. Wind warnings over now for St. Lawrence Island, the Bering Strait coast. But very gusty winds up along the western Arctic coast down to Point Hope, and 35 to 45 mile-an-hour wind gusts on the eastern Arctic coast. That forecasting continues tonight and then gradually diminish after midnight up there. But the winter weather advisory for blowing snow and wind chills continue, especially on the western Arctic coast into the western Brooks Range and through the passes. Areas of snow along the Yukon River Valley or snow showers, mostly cloudy skies, and same thing for the Kuskokwim Valley, much of the southwest interior, cloudy skies with areas of light snow or snow showers. Low pressure continues to hang just south of the Kenai Peninsula. Look for some rain and snow showers for Kodiak Island. The winds become a little more northwesterly with it pulling to the north there, and that may start to drop the snowfall levels down back towards sea level a little bit there, but areas of light rain and snow for the North Gulf Coast, or just plain rain actually along the coastline, and more showery over the Panhandle, and that couple of low centers out over the southwest Bering Sea. Not too intense at all. That's going to make for very light wind conditions out there with areas of snow showers continuing, central and western Aleutians, and then that weak front, look for an area of continuous light snow there with a stronger northeast winds there to the north of that, but even those are coming down. For tomorrow, not much change out there. Still low pressure over the north or west central Aleutians, just to the north of the west central Aleutians. Another system coming onto the chart there brings an increase in the chance of rain to the eastern Aleutians late in the day. Otherwise, some scattered rain and snow showers for the Alaska Peninsula. Pretty dry for the southwest coast and Bristol Bay area. And again, low pressure continues to weaken just south of the Kenai Peninsula. That'll keep it cloudy and showery over the Kenai Peninsula. Again, precipitation in the form of rain or snow, maybe even still some areas of possible freezing rain, but mainly rain, again, from Seward up along into Prince William Sound, Whittier, Portage, and the North Gulf Coast. Rain and snow showers over the Panhandle, mostly in the form of rain on the south coast there, and really starting to scatter out over the inland areas. But it looks like some chance of snow all the way up to about the crest of the Brooks Range, north of the mountains there, variably cloudy with some possible clearing and much lighter winds, but still pretty gusty for the DeLong Mountains, western Brooks Range, places like Howard Pass, Lookout Ridge, and those areas will still see that strong northeast wind. And for Wednesday, not much change up that way. A little less wind there on the west side or the northwestern part of the state, and areas of snow or snow showers over much of the interior, especially in the west. Less of that as you get toward the eastern and central interior of the state, and a trough swinging some more moisture in on Wednesday. But downslope areas should be pretty dry for south central Alaska, like Anchor Point up to Palmer, including Anchorage. Probably a dry day. Moisture layer just not deep enough to jump the Chugach Mountains there. So the heaviest precipitation again will be on the southern Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound, still unsettled for the Panhandle and North Gulf Coast, and east-northeast winds continue out over the Bering Sea with some snow from the Pribilofs and areas of light snow all the way up to the Bering Strait in toward Kotzebue Sound. And for the lows tonight, mid-20s up around Skagway and Haines to upper 30s to the south and along the coast, near zero Copper River Basin, below zero in the Kuskokwim Valley. Otherwise, upper 20s to mid-30s, south central Alaska, lower 30s Kodiak. Highs tomorrow, mid-teens, Copper River Basin, 5 below to 10 above in the Kuskokwim Valley, 20 to 25 Bristol Bay. Mostly in the 30s, south central Alaska, Kodiak Island, and the Panhandle, though some areas reaching the lower 40s. Lows upper 20s to mid-30s for the Panhandle on Wednesday morning. A little below zero, Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley. Single numbers, Bristol Bay, upper 20s Kodiak, and 15 to 25 for south central Alaska, followed by highs Wednesday afternoon. 30s for the Panhandle, lower 30s in the north, and single numbers in the Copper River Basin. 20s south central Alaska, mid-30s toward Homer, and chilliest over the Kuskokwim Valley in the north, otherwise 20 to 30 for the Bristol Bay area. Up north of the Alaska Range in the interior, lows pretty much below zero tonight. Again, coldest in the northeast and eastern interior. And then highs tomorrow, still below zero in the interior, but not quite as far as what we've seen. And about 12 for Nome, 13 for Savunga. Lows below zero, anywhere from 5 to 25 below, all the way to the Arctic coast, near zero for Nome, 6 for Savunga, and highs right around zero for the central interior, below zero for the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. And for the southwest coast, lows right around zero tonight, mid-20s for the Pribilofs, mid-20s for AKwx.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to Tuesday morning's flying weather graphic. VFR there from St. Lawrence Island, across the Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea, as well as the Arctic coast, North Slope. Then south of the Brooks Range, marginal VFR all the way down to southern Alaska, where it becomes IFR along the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, across the Kenai Peninsula, and up across Prince William Sound northward to the east central Alaska Range, and then over to Yakutat, Panhandle, IFR, eastern central Aleutians, and marginal VFR for the Alaska Peninsula. Moving on to the afternoon Tuesday. Now some IFR there for the eastern Arctic coast, pretty isolated there, and IFR over the west central interior, lower Yukon River Valley, actually across the Kuskokwim Valley, down across Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, and Yakutat, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, IFR, marginal VFR for the remainder of the southeast coastal areas. VFR, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, up into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Togiak, Cape Newenham, Pribilos VFR again, and then for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians to Atka, marginal VFR, AKwx, VFR, and then some more IFR farther to the west. And for Wednesday morning, next system spreading a pretty good zone of IFR into the southern Bering Sea and across the Aleutians there to the Alaska Peninsula and northward to the Pribilofs by morning. Then kind of a break there between, in advance of that system, pushing a VFR to Nunivak Island and Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coastal areas. Otherwise, much of Alaska marginal VFR, as well as a panhandle. Some IFR, though, for northern Cook Inlet down to about Kenai and just to the south. And also up along the Yukon Flats, VFR, the Arctic coast, North Slope. And for Wednesday afternoon, some IFR now along the northwest coast, Kotzebue Sound, Selawik, Kobuk valleys in toward the Koyukuk Valley and south across the Yukon River. Another area of IFR along the Alaska Range and a smaller area for the North Gulf Coast, Resurrection Bay there. Eastward to near Yakutat, then it improves, and some lingering IFR of northern Panhandle, VFR to the south, and a zone of IFR there from the Alaska Peninsula, actually lying across the southern Bering Sea. Passes Hanatuvik, Kanatagan, both VFR tomorrow, and especially in the afternoon hours, late morning to afternoon, could be marginal to start. Lake Clark and Merrill look to be IFR throughout the day, as does Rainy. Windy, marginal VFR to VFR, some improvement there with the lower conditions early on in the morning, then becoming VFR for most of the day. Isabel, same thing, marginal to start, VFR probably by midday through the afternoon into evening. Mentasta, same pattern, lower conditions early on, and then VFR on either approach. For Tanita, marginal VFR to start and becoming VFR. Portage looks to be IFR the entire day, and Chilkoot and White, same thing, IFR. Freezing levels here, really not much to look at. The jet stream far to the south now, 2,000 feet up across Prince of Wales Island, but well south of the Aleutians. At the surface tomorrow morning for the central and western Aleutians, and then it kind of pushes north of the Pribilofs and in across southern interior Alaska. Icing, could be some isolated moderate icing across southern Alaska into the northern Panhandle, and another zone across Kuskokwim Valley that extends up the Yukon Valley there to the eastern Brooks Range, and some icing mainly over the western and southwest Bering Sea to the western Aleutians. And then the next system, there's just edging some elevated icing threats up toward the eastern Aleutians in the afternoon hours. And southerly winds about 75 knots. That's what will be pushing that moisture northward to the Fox Islands tomorrow. Otherwise, the main jet well south of the forecast area. So looking at 9,000 feet, west-northwest 25 to 35 knots. Bristol Bay in the southwest coast. Easterlies 40 to as high as 50 knots. Strongest Cape Lisburne and Point Hope area. And 3,000 feet, 50 to 65 knots up there from along the north slope in the western Arctic coastal areas. Taking a look at turbulence with those winds up there, look for considerable moderate turbulence, surface to 5,000 feet. Western Brooks Range, Point Hope, Cape Lisburne. Otherwise, pretty smooth around the remainder of Alaska, including the Aleutians and the Bering Sea.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet, and some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes. Okay. Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now, the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. Okay. It's called the highly elliptical orbit. Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work. Sure. Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse. Okay. And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse, and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical. And the
foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes. Okay. We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes. That thing is moving. It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
There it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space-worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator. Okay. So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth over?
Focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go
kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here, it's going to be close to the Earth. It's going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower. It has to. That's the laws of motion. And such like that, repeating.
Wow.
Now, the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here, and they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a constant frame of reference, and you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska, and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites over the equator, it's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit, whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here, would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long-range view that's looking top-down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. It's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. Again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to come. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at GINA at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at today's sea ice analysis, sea ice continue to advance westward and to a lesser extent southwestward, with the kind of thin area there along the southwest Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coastline due to the strong east winds blowing the heavier ice out to the west and then newer ice forming in that open area. And that pattern will continue for the next 2 or 3 days or so. And from there, going to the coastal water forecast. For the coast, for the south coast tomorrow, or the panhandle, northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Otherwise, pretty light in the north there on the north coast. From the south, 10 to 15 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, south winds at 10 knots. Stevens Passage, northwest at 10. And Clarence Strait, light northwest breeze at 15 knots, but seas up to 7 feet. Then small craft advisories for Clarence Strait on Wednesday. Southeast winds 25 knots. Stevens Passage, east winds at 20. And Lynn Canal, north at 20. Otherwise, gale warnings on the south coast. Southeast winds 35 to 40 knots, and southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the north coast. Prince William Sound Tuesday, east winds 15 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Barren Islands, west winds 25 knots. Northwest 25, Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds at 15 knots. And for Wednesday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots. East winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands. East winds 35 knots with 11-foot seas. North Gulf Coast, east-southeast winds 30 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds at 20 knots. Kodiak Island Tuesday, west winds 30 knots, seas 6 to 14 feet. The Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds 15 knots, 4 to 8-foot seas there. Bristol Bay, west winds at 15 knots. Then on Wednesday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, east to southeast winds 35 knots, Bristol Bay northeast winds at 30 knots, and Kodiak Island, gale warnings, east winds 35 knots. Eastern Aleutians on Tuesday, southeast winds and south winds, south to southeast winds, 20 to 30 knots with seas running 6 to 12 feet. Variable to southeast winds for the central Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots, and for the western Aleutians, north winds 25 knots. And for Wednesday, western Aleutians, north winds 25 to 30 knots, central Aleutians, north to northwesterlies at 25 to 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, northeast and northwest winds, 25 to 35 knots with seas 15 to 20 feet. Light winds for the southwest coast tomorrow, light and variable at 10 knots with seas 3 feet in the ice-free areas. Southeast winds 20 knots for the Pribilofs, east winds 15 knots for St. Matthew Island. St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds at 30 knots with 10-foot seas. And Norton Sound, northeast at 20. Norton Sound on Wednesday, northeast at 15, northeast 25 for St. Lawrence Island. Yukon Delta Coast, north winds 25 knots. Kuskokwim Delta Coast, northeast at 30 knots. And for the Pribilofs, winds will be north at 30. And St. Matthew Island, northeast 25. For the eastern Boulevard Seacoast, brisk wind advisory, east-northeasterlies tomorrow, 25 to 30 knots. Lighter winds on the central coast, northeast at 20, then back to brisk wind advisories on the western Arctic coast, northeast 25 knots. Cape Lisburne to Point Hope, northeast at 40, and then the Chukchi Sea, northeast 30. And for Wednesday, Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Western and central Arctic coast, winds will be northeast at 20 knots. And brisk wind advisories continue for the eastern Arctic coast for east-northeasterlies at 25 knots. For tonight, snow or wind and blowing snow, mainly along the western Arctic coast. As conditions improve on the east side there gradually. Areas of snow in the interior. Low pressure stationary just south of the Kenai Peninsula keeps rain and snow, possible freezing rain over south central Alaska. More showery for the panhandle. And for tomorrow, that low still just south of the Kenai Peninsula keeps rain and snow going over south central Alaska with rain along the North Gulf Coast into the Kenai Peninsula. Showers for the panhandle. Areas of snow over the interior except for the north slope to the Arctic coast. And then another front pushes northward across the eastern Aleutians early on Wednesday with areas of snow over the western interior and still wet.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.